Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing my friend Bruce Ashford, who is dean at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in North Carolina. And I believe he is in a hotel room right now with his children, giving his wife a much needed vacation. I'm going to talk to Bruce about the state of public theology or of political theology in American evangelicalism today. He's been doing quite a bit of work on this topic, and so I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you, Bruce, for being available.
Hey, it's great to do the show, and you're right. I'm on a staycation with the kids right now, giving my wife a break during this coronavirus plague. And so I apologize that I've got a microwave in the background, but I think we can still talk about political theology, even in spite of that.
We can. It makes you seem more authentic this way. Well, firstly, I have to ask you, how are you and the seminary dealing with the pandemic? Al Mohler was saying the other day that Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville has, of course, announced some cutbacks in their budget and is also reducing their tuition for students next semester. What are you all doing there in North Carolina?
Yeah, so we're in pretty good shape financially, as best shape you can be in these days. We got three revenue streams: Southern Baptist Convention and donors, and those are unsure. Our third is tuition, so we're going to try to make sure enrollment is up so we have that revenue stream. We're going to do everything we can not to lay off anybody. And any faculty or any essential staff, we might have to. Our hands, it's possible that our hands will be forced, but we'd like to not have to do that. We're doing pretty well. I think times like these are awful. Suicides are up, divorce rates are up, opioid addiction, alcohol addiction are up. Really kind of an awful time, but God often historically does his greatest work in the midst of the worst circumstances. I think that the plague swept through Rome twice during early church years, and both times the Christians were the only ones willing to stare death in the face and stay behind to take care of the sick and the dying. And as Rodney Stark pointed out, that was one of the reasons for the explosive growth of Christianity. And that may seem like a dramatic comparison. Maybe, it is, but it's the only comparison I've got. Maybe somehow the Lord will work through an awful event to bring some sort of unity to his church and maybe even to our nation. I think we're in a very bad moment socially. And because we're in a bad moment socially, we're in a bad moment politically. And, I've racked my brain to figure out what there is that could bring some change to that. And maybe the Lord will bring something good out of this.
Well, certainly it's an opportunity for the church to share its message and to identify what it's truly about. Bruce, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary is the second or the third largest seminary in America. Is that accurate?
Depends on how you count the numbers, whether you're doing non-duplicating headcount or FTEs, or whether you include people doing certificates or not. So we're in the top three. We're big, very big seminary, and that brings some great benefits to that and also some challenges.
Well, very good. Regarding political theology and public theology, it's my perspective that we're in a very bad way on those topics among American Christians, especially among American evangelicals. My view is that much of this is owing to the collapse of the great Protestant traditions and the memories that go along with them. And so evangelicals are simply floating in the moment and believe that as they address society, they have to essentially make it up on their own or to align with contemporary ideological perspectives. But you've been doing a great deal of work on the topics of public theology and political theology. So if you would share what some of that work has been and what your views are in terms of where we are today.
Yeah, let me do that. And you mentioned two different terms. Let me try to define those just for those people out there watching. Political theology and public theology, there's a lot of overlap between these two disciplines. They're a little different, but they're also in some way that's similar. Political theology arose mostly in England and on the continent. And it's a reaction against sectarianism on the one hand, kind of a Christianity withdrawing from society, and secularism on the other hand. So it's an attempt to, instead of withdrawing or being a secular, it's an attempt to take Christian truth and bring it to bear upon the political sphere. Public theology arose in the Netherlands and the United States and Canada. And similar to political theology, it is a reaction to sectarianism on the one hand and secularism on the other hand. But differently than political theology is it focuses much more broadly on the whole architecture of society. So instead of just politics, on the way the different spheres of culture fit together, you know, art, science, politics, education, marriage and family, you know, all of these, how they hang together. And so that's a difference in focus. So I'm a public theologian who also, as you noted, has focused quite a bit on the political sphere. I think the Catholics have always had a pretty strong tradition in political theology and public theology. I wouldn't always agree with the different forms of political and public theology that have arisen from the Catholic Church, but they have a very strong tradition, and do also today. Protestant tradition is less well developed, and especially Baptists. I'm a Baptist by conviction, and we're very strong historically at evangelism, missions. We have a high belief, high view of Scripture. One of the things we have not developed is a consensual tradition in public theology. We don't have anything like the tradition of Catholic social teaching that has been developed over the centuries and so forth. And I would like to help be a part of that project as a Baptist. And as an evangelical, I think we need to give sustained thought and reflection to the appropriate relationship between Christianity and the various spheres of culture, and then specifically between Christianity and politics. And so I've tried to do that, have always wanted to do that. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, just became determined to do that, and made some career changes and began writing in this sphere. I think it's very important, if we are ambassadors of the King, of Jesus Christ, that we have a proper understanding between that relationship, pledging ultimate allegiance to Christ, and the other relationship we have, which is pledging a more tentative allegiance to a nation, a political party, a political leader. And then finally, we need to give concerted effort to come into good conclusions on policy positions. The Bible does not speak directly to public policy issues in a 21st century democratic republic. It speaks very directly to moral issues, but then the jump from moral to political is very significant. People tend to think that it's easy, but it's not. For example, can we just sit down and say, let's rank the worst sins in the Bible? Let's have a ranking, and then take the very worst things that the Bible says, and let's punish those things with a felony. No, I mean, the worst things in the Bible are idolatry and pride. And so the entire nation would be incarcerated. So it's a very tricky and complicated thing. And people, we need to rely on people who are competent to inform us. We're in a democratic republic, rather than just listening to carnival barkers on TV. A lot of these folks lack integrity, journalists, and so forth. They're trying to make money. And so they play to anger and fear, and they simplify it to the extreme. And so not always a good source of information. As citizens, we're gonna have to find trustworthy people and listen to those people and put our own thought into things. And then hopefully, as Christian citizens of the United States of America, we can somehow speak a good word into a bad moment, help achieve the common good.
Regarding political theology and public theology, could you identify the 3 or 4 major streams of thought among the respective Protestant traditions? And has there been a specific Baptist contribution to this sphere? That would be in the area of religious liberty, I assume, but are there other areas where Baptists have distinguished themselves?
Yeah, so the kind of, if you're breaking down views of Christianity and politics, one of the most helpful ways to do it is views on Christianity and politics are very similar to views on Christianity and culture at large. And I'm going to do my best to communicate clearly these categories. So there's one category that can be called, so historically Christians have talked about this in terms of grace and nature. And what they mean by grace is God's saving works and word. And what they mean by nature is really culture, the natural world and the cultural stuff that we've built into it. And the question is, how do God's saving works and word relate to life in this world, our cultural lives? And there are some different answers given to that. The sort of atheistic answer that is also functionally the classical liberal answer is that we live in a natural and cultural world where God's saving works and word don't really intervene. Religion is a human construction, etc. So we dismiss that view. I think most of the people listening to this podcast do. I won't spend a lot of time on it. I think that God created the world and he does intervene in it. Another view could be called, so that view would be the nature without grace view. Another view, which is the Anabaptist view, would be, or many Anabaptists held to it, is something that we could call the grace against nature model. And this model holds that after the fall, the world became corrupted and bad in its very essence. And so we sort of build the church alongside of the world, and we prophetically rebuke the world when it goes badly, and we call the world to salvation in Christ, but we're not trying to build cultural institutions, right? There's no reason to do that under this view. I'll fly away. God's going to firebomb the world one day. So why should we spend our energies trying to Christianize it? So I don't like this view at all, because I believe that although the world is twisted in a wrong direction after the fall towards idols and false gods, that it's not bad in and of itself, and that God's not going to firebomb it. That when Peter talked about a fire, that instead of annihilate it, can also be translated that God will purify the world or find the world by fire. In other words, our future is that he's going to purify this heavens and earth and live with us forever on it. Another view could be called the grace above nature view. And this is a view that the world could be viewed as a two-story house. And if you compare the fall to a leak in the house, the leak leaked into the upper floor and messed it up. And the way to fix it is through God's saving works and word. And the stuff in the upper realm is things like spirituality, church attendance, and that kind of thing. And so you bring God's saving works and word in to help people come back to know the Lord, live their life, live their personal ethics the right way. But the lower floor, which is our common life together, our cultural life, didn't get messed up. The leak didn't go to the lower floor. And so you don't need to bring God's saving works and word into art and science, politics. You just need to leave it out. So I don't agree with this view, because I think the leak affected both floors. If I keep the two-floor analogy, I don't think there's two floors. I think there's only one. But to keep the analogy, the leak messed up the whole house. And the problem on the lower floor is actually religious. The problem with when you have warped cultural institutions that have been shaped by warped people, sinners, all of us, that's not a religionless warping. I mean, everybody is a worshiper, and we're either worshiping God or idols, sex or money or power, we're worshiping. And so it's that false worship that's actually corrupting the lower floor. And if there's a religious problem, there's also a religious answer. And so I do think in appropriate ways, we need to bring God's saving works and word into public discussion. Not a theocratic manner. We can talk about that if you want. Another view is similar to that, and it's the grace alongside of nature model. And that views the world as more like a duplex, right? So you still have, instead of, you take the two stories and you tip them on the sides. And the things that happen on the right-hand side are religious things, church gatherings, spirituality, devotions with the Lord, personal ethics. The rest of the world is on the left-hand side. And it's better than the grace above nature model, because it does recognize that all of these things are important and so forth. But this view wants to make very clear that you don't need to bring God's saving works and word into these other cultural realities, and that these things shouldn't be viewed as part of the Christian mission, right? Your vocation shouldn't be considered that. So I don't like this view because I think that everything in life is part of the Christian mission. And if done rightly, according to God's will, should be considered kingdom work. A Christian who does a good job as a teacher or a farmer or a president of the Institute of Religion and Democracy is participating in the Christian mission. And I think that stuff is kingdom work. So that brings me to the last model, which is the grace restores nature or grace infuses nature model. That's mine. And our view is that after the fall, the whole world is now twisted in wrong directions toward idols, sex and money and power and false religions, etc. And yet the world isn't bad in and of itself, right? This is my Father's world. And whenever the Bible speaks negatively about the world, it's speaking to the twisting that's happened because of sin. Whenever it speaks positively about the world, it's talking about the world in its essence. And so therefore, if the basic ordering of the world, the moral law, different spheres of culture, land, water, air, the way God ordered the world, if that remains good, then it makes perfect sense that the new heavens and earth is this heavens and earth. And if that's true, then that vests all of life with significance, not just ecclesiastical matters, but marriage and family, sports and competition, politics and economics, scholarship and education, business and entrepreneurship. All of this matters to God, and it means that our vocation, our leisure, that the whole of our life matters to God. And that's my take. The Baptist contribution, the signal contribution we've had, has been religious liberty. Baptists have two streams, the Anabaptist stream and the English Reformation stream. The Anabaptist stream is more Arminian. The English Reformation stream is more Reformed. But both streams have promoted religious liberty and said, listen, the gospel is freely given, freely received, and we would like to create the conditions politically where people don't have to pretend. Say if we're in a predominantly Christian nation, we don't want people to have to pretend to be a Christian to get society's benefits. We think that works against them spiritually. It can lure people into a false sort of trust in Christ that's really just using him to get temporal goods. And so we think that's a very unhelpful way of construing the relationship of church and state, to set one religion up as de facto state religion. It's not helpful.
Bruce, the conversation you and I are having now, with notable exceptions, seems to be largely absent from American evangelicalism today, including even in, my impression is, including even in Christian academia. Is that accurate? And if so, why so?
Well, if we're just talking broader society, I think there is an elevated awareness of the importance of politics. And I think that's because the political sphere has become way too significant. Everything is politicized right now. Unfortunately, there's a lot more heat than there is light. Many or most of the people who are doing cultural commentary and political commentary, including Christians, their categories of thought are fundamentally secular, have been bequeathed to them by political parties and political pundits on television for whom their narrative is kind of the true story of the whole world. But for Christians, we need the Bible's narrative of the world to be the master narrative, and to always be judging other narratives from a political party or from a preferred TV network or radio host, and really be very careful that we're not baptizing aspects of a political party's agenda or a political leader's agenda that are actually antithetical to Christian principles. And so on the whole, you're right. I don't think there's a lot of serious thinking going on. I think there's a lot of anger, and I think the news outlets are cynically loving it and making an enormous amount of cash. They know that if they can make us angry and afraid, that we will be addicted to their radio, their TV, and their websites. And so they're pouring gasoline on the fire right now. At the academic level, there's actually a renaissance right now in public theology and political theology. And behind closed doors with all the people that I know, not only has there been some significant literature produced in the past 4 or 5 years, I think in the next decade, there's going to be an enormous amount of literature. Catholic thinkers are being revitalized right now, but so are Protestants. And there are quite a few young public theologians. We started a PhD program in public theology at Southeastern, and we've got, 20 or 25 students in it, and they're very sharp. I'm very excited. So what could come out of this in upcoming decades?
Who, in your view, are the important rising voices now in the sphere of political theology and public theology?
Well, in the Baptist world, Jonathan Leeman is a very significant name. He's fairly young. He's in his mid-40s. I assume that's young these days because I'm also in my mid-40s. Can we count that as young?
Absolutely.
Jonathan's significant. He wrote a book called, I think it was called Political Church. That is the most significant work of Baptist political theology in memory. So that's very important. There are at least 40 or 50 other Baptist public theologians who are either working on a PhD or recently have gotten a PhD in public theology or a related discipline who are beginning to write and think. None of them are especially prominent right now. So if you look out in the Catholic world, I think one of the most important philosophers is Daniel Mahoney, wrote a book called The Idol of Our Age, which is a very significant treatment of and argument against a strain of progressive thought that thinks that we can bring an imminent salvation to this world, that there's no salvation that's going to be brought by God. And so we have to bring it ourselves. And the way to bring it is to get rid of borders and religions. If you can have a borderless world, weaken nation states, and if you can weaken strong forms of religion, then you can kind of curb evil, and humanity can take a great leap forward. And so people like Mahoney are pointing out that some very significant difficulties on the left and some on the right. Pierre Manent, M-A-N-E-N-T, French political philosopher, is very significant, powerful writer and thinker, and his works being translated from French into English. I would point people to him. Craig Bartholomew in England, Anglican, public theologian at the Kirby Lang Institute for Christian Ethics, is a significant writer on these topics. I'm trying to do my best to contribute. I've got a few books. One Nation Under God is a book. I've got one called Letters to an American Christian, and then an ebook coming out next month called How to Survive an Election Season. So in particular, this election season, 2020.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like you're very hopeful about the future in this area, Bruce.
I am. I mean, I tend to be a little bit cynical and pessimistic about developments in America. I think we've been developing in the wrong direction for a few hundred years. And in particular, our expressive individualism, which is just the view that the point of life is to be authentic. And the way to be authentic is to align your life with your deepest desires. And the way to be a good society is to applaud people as heroic whenever they align their life with their deepest desires. I think that is fundamentally wrongheaded. That one of the worst things we can do usually is to align ourselves with our deepest desires, because often our deepest desires are sinful. Our deepest desires are to fire God from his post and live life without limits. And that this is seriously detrimental, and that society should not applaud me every time I align my life with my deepest desires. So I think that's the driving impulse in the US right now. It's been building for a couple hundred years. I don't think there are political solutions to that. There are some political things we can do to help curb the bad effects of it. But that's ultimately a spiritual and cultural solution that's needed. Like the solution to that is going to have to be in people's hearts and minds and through churches, but also through art and science and politics and sports. And it's all of these spheres combined that are warped by that kind of thinking. I do have confidence, however, that God does some of his greatest work, even in the worst moments in history, and even in countries that are full of a deep rebellion against him and the moral law. And so we do have that hope, even if things don't look like they're headed in the right direction.
Well, on that appropriate note, thank you, Bruce Ashford, Dean of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. We appreciate your wisdom, look forward to your next book, and anticipate your next visit to Washington, D.C. when normal times hopefully will return.
Great. Thank you so much. Been a lot of fun to talk today.
And enjoy your sort of vacation.
I'll do it.
All right. Thanks, Bruce. Take care.